Welcome to the Midsters Podcast, your podcast for inspiration on being bold and saying yes to making the most of your midlife. So today's conversation is something that I've been thinking about for a long time as a good topic. And I think it's probably something that's relatable to a lot of our audience. And I'd like to start out, if I can I tell a story?
Sure.
Okay.
Love your stories.
And this is a little bit of a challenging story, which is kind of the point. When my son got his driver's license as a teenager, we were going on a family vacation to a lake house, and it was about 4 hours drive from home. And we were going to take 2 cars because we allowed each of the kids to invite a friend on the trip. So we had my husband, myself, 4 kids, and 2 dogs, and all of our stuff to take to this lake house. So we were going to take 2 cars. And right before we left, my son asked if it would be okay if he would drive one of the cars. My initial thought was it was not a good idea because, he was still a pretty young driver.
Right.
But he could be very persuasive. And so we agreed to let him and his friend Max drive in the one car, and my husband and I, with the girls and the dogs, would drive in the other car. But because I was very worried about this, I said to him, just make sure you stay behind us and do everything that we do. Do not pass us. Do not get in the lead. Just stay behind our car and just do what we do. I failed to take into account in that moment how literal my son is. And he is a very literal person. So we were fine for 4 hours of the drive. But when we got to the lake, to the area where we had the lake house, we had to stop at a marina because we were picking up a boat. So my husband jumped out of our car and went to go deal with the boat. And he was going to take the boat to the house. And I was going to drive and lead the way back to the house. This required pulling out of the parking lot, crossing 2 lanes of traffic, and making a left turn. And as I sat there at the edge of the parking lot, waiting to make that turn, I noticed that there was a lot of traffic going each way.
Right.
And it was very hard to get a clearing to pull through. And as soon as I saw my opportunity, I pulled out. And as soon as I did that, like a voice in my head, I heard myself saying to my son, make sure you stay right behind us and do everything that we do. And I thought, oh my God, I hope he didn't just pull out after me and knows enough to wait for his own break in the traffic. And I heard the crash, and I looked in the rearview mirror to see the truck that had hit him and to see our car skittering 40 yards up the road.
Wow.
And my heart almost stopped. I pulled over, I got out of the car, I ran down the road, and I could see my husband running up from the marina because he'd heard the crash.
Yeah.
And the car in which Harry and his friend were driving had no windows left. All the airbags had deployed. The whole side of the car was crashed. And I thought, I just killed my son. And then I heard the truck driver who hit him, he was T-boned by a truck, say, they're okay. Miraculously, both boys survived that impact without any injury. And the EMTs who came to the scene, because the fire truck came, the police came, everybody came, they were amazed. Like, that shouldn't have happened. So there's a good ending to it. Everyone was fine.
Yeah.
But for a long time after that, I carried so much guilt and shame and just, I was distraught with myself because I had made a mistake that had almost cost my son his life.
Right.
And I really almost couldn't live with it. I couldn't sleep. I was just miserable. It took me a while to get to a point where I could forgive myself because as a mom, I almost felt like I have to be perfect. I can't make a mistake when it comes to my kids. And yet I had just made a really serious blunder.
Mhm.
And I suspect that there are other women out there who have experienced the same thing. In the core part of your life where your heart resides, you have at some point made a mistake that is just a real challenge to get beyond. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about how to get beyond that.
Yeah. No, that's a good topic. That story. I mean, thank God he was okay. And you're talking about how it made you feel. I'm sure you've had conversations of how it made Harry feel. as well. But the lessons in that for him ha- must be huge, because I think that we can't be wise without first being wrong. So opening up his mind to the fact that something's not always concrete, and thinking of his life throughout his next 60, 70, 80 years, to not all to use your own judgment as well. At that age, you don't. He's following his mother's instructions. But I just feel like a lot of our mistakes in life allow us to be wiser. I don't think we can be wiser without being wrong and making mistakes. There's beauty in it. Also, there's harm in it. So I'm not saying that. Um, but I do think that you said that you felt so bad about it. And I can imagine that. But I think for people that are going through that right now, try and embrace the lessons in it and how it changes and the self growth of it. Like, that is something you'd probably never say to someone else ever again. I mean, your conversation would be very different, right? And the way he would listen to somebody in the future is going to be very different. But it's hard at the moment, especially when you're seeing, flashing lights and all of that. You're not thinking about that. But I think the nice thing about personal growth from things like that, and as we get older, I think in our stage, we learn not to ruminate. We learn to reflect and look at the good in things as well. But we all do. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life.
I think part of the challenge for me was my first instinct was almost to blame him for not thinking for himself.
Hmm.
And in order to kind of get past it, I had to stop and really own it.
Right.
And yes, he probably should have thought. He ended up getting a ticket for the accident, which was, if that was the only thing that was going to happen, that was great. Um, and by the way, the reason he survived is because we were in an Audi with steel reinforced doors. Had we been in a different car, he wouldn't have.
Wow.
Um, but my first instinct was to sort of shift blame. Like, I can't take this on.
Hmm.
How could you possibly follow behind me and not think that you have to wait for your own opening in traffic?
Right.
But I had to kind of stop and say, no, I have to own this, because I was the one who specifically told him, don't think for yourself.
Right.
Trust me. I'm your mother. I will look out for you.
Yeah.
It was on me. And I had to own that first before I could even begin to get past it.
Right.
But the problem with that is it carried so much, not just guilt, but shame. Shame that I did not meet the standard I had set for myself, and therefore I was deficient. And I think the first step in healing from that was to separate out that shame, identify it, and dismiss it,
Right.
because it was a mistake and it didn't define who I am.
Right. And shame can make you who you are. You do have to, like, a mistake's a mistake. So taking on the shame, I think, is self-destroying. It's the opposite of the personal growth from something. So I think
Exactly.
when people make a mistake and for whatever reason they accept the shame in it, it destroys. It doesn't build character. It breaks it down. And I think mistakes can build character, which is really important. I think about, like, when you're young, all the mistakes that you make. And we actually, as parents, think about mistakes differently when our kids make them versus
When
we make them. Actually, I wanted my children to make as many mistakes as they were going to while they were under my roof. So it could be a teaching experience and a personal growth experience for both of us, because once they leave the house, if they weren't given that room to make the mistakes, they're going to make them later, and they could be much bigger.
And I think an important piece of embracing your mistakes as a parent, and we could talk separately about other kinds of mistakes in other relationships in life, but this story was about parenting. Um, One of the advantages to embracing your mistakes as a parent is the modeling that you do. Children learn from what they see. And, being able to say, I am sorry. I really goofed up. I didn't take into account there's no way I could take into account every circumstance you were going to confront. I should have been more open in my direction to you. Allow my kids to see it's okay to make mistakes. And hopefully down the road in their lives, when they make them, which they will, they won't feel the kind of shame that I felt believing that I couldn't make a mistake, that it would be wrong to make a mistake. And so, sort of showing them how to forgive themselves.
Right. On the flip side of that, I had a situation with my youngest son. He was at a lottery school called HB Woodlawn, a beautiful school. It's middle school and high school, and he got in the lottery in middle school, and he chose, and so he did his ninth grade or started his ninth grade going to that school, but he loves sports, and he didn't allow me to make a mistake for him. I love that he had his independent thinking and actually said, "No, mom." I was thinking he should stay there for the entire length of his education, I thought that I knew what was best for him, and it would have been a mistake for him to have ever listened to me and not push back on that. I valued the fact that he said, "No, this is what I need to do." And then I was like, "Okay, but I think it might be a mistake." In my head, it was far from a mistake. The mistake would have been me, thinking that I knew what was best for him. We do at times, but also kids know for themselves. So he actually stopped a mistake from being made, right? By having this intuition and this instinct that no, this is what's best for me. So and I was just going to allow him to make that mistake and figure it out. And then if he came back to HB, he came back to HB. Mum would be the word, but in fact, it wasn't a mistake. Is exactly what was right. And I think that the universe has its own wisdom sometimes. And I think kids are wise.
One of my other epic parental fails actually is kind of related to that, how wise children can be. And this was another kind of shame-inducing moment that we got past. But my son had a false bout of appendicitis when he was 10. They thought he had appendicitis. They did an MRI. They were sure they could see it on the film. He couldn't be operated on at the hospital where we had taken him to the emergency room because they didn't do pediatric surgery. So they transported by ambulance to another hospital, and the surgeon there came to see us. She was going to do surgery in, half an hour. She was prepping the OR. And then she disappeared. And she came back a while later and said, "Son, when did you last go to the bathroom?" He didn't have appendicitis. He was constipated. Fast forward 2 years later, my daughter comes home from her birthday party after eating copious amounts of pizza and ice cream and says, "Mommy, I have appendicitis." And I'm like, she's 10 years old. She doesn't even know what appendicitis is. Plus, how would you know? You only get appendicitis once in your life. So I said, "You had too much cake and ice cream. Go to bed." And she said, "No, no, no, it's appendicitis." I was like, "Lindsay, you do not have appendicitis. You ate too much. Of course you have a tummy ache." And I will say she didn't run a fever. She did throw up, but only once, which is consistent with too much cake and ice cream. So I let it go all night. And the next morning, she said, "Mommy, I have appendicitis. Why are you not taking this seriously?" So I called the pediatrician and said, "She's been complaining of a tummy ache, but I mean, it's a nothing burger. She only threw up once. She doesn't have a fever. Can you talk to her and tell her she's okay?" And the pediatrician said to me, "Where did you get your medical degree? Why haven't you taken her to the emergency room? What's wrong with you?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I don't think it's a big deal." He said, "You always have to respond to a kid complaining of a bad stomach ache. It's an hour of your time to go to the ER. Do it." So we went to the ER, and an hour and a half later, they did an emergency appendectomy because she was right.
Yeah.
She knew it.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how she knew it. But again, implicit in that story is I, as the mom, I was almost overthinking it. Like we had fake appendicitis,
Mm-hmm.
so now this must also be fake appendicitis, and I deeply regretted that I didn't listen to her. And let me tell you something, she did not let me live that down easily.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Humans tend to listen to patterns, and we get caught up in the patterns of things. And so I think you were getting caught up in the pattern of something, because if it had happened isolated from the first, you would have taken her.
I
The
probably would.
intuition would have done that.
The point that I would take away from all this is I had to do some work on myself to get past the fact that I was not the parent I believed myself to be.
Yeah.
I think of myself as a really good mom, but I made two, fairly significant errors that
Right.
could have impacted the health and wellness and life of my
Yeah.
children. And that was really hard to accept.
Right.
I was fallible. I was wrong. I destroyed or diminished, didn't destroy, but diminished, at least for a time, their trust in me,
Yeah.
which is what I'm there for. I am the person they should always be able to have
Mhm.
trust in. And moving past that required effort.
Yeah.
And I would say the first step in that is to accept that I'm human and humans do make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes don't always just affect us, they affect the people around us.
If we didn't make mistakes, we wouldn't grow. So the one thing I love about the humans and the human spirit is, in fact, that mistakes have a positive end to them most of the time. It does allow us to open our perspective, to grow. And I think there's humor in it in a lot of times as well. I just think about all the things that have happened in my life and in my household. The things we tend to remember are the funny mistakes or things that happened in our household. So I think, like, we do have to forgive ourselves. We know we're gonna make another mistake. I'm messy about mistakes. I make them all the time. I try not to, but again, I have to just forgive myself and move on. I know there are heavier mistakes that people make that have lifelong consequences, but the majority of them are light, and they help us grow, and they help us understand somebody else, right? And how why and the other thing I like about not that I like making mistakes or watching other people make mistakes, but it does shift my perspective of people. Like, people, I can look at somebody that made a mistake, and I like thinking sometimes how'd they get there, why'd they do that, because there's a compassionate piece to it that allows you, well, of course, they stole that piece of bread. They have no money. They have, so there's a whole other element to it too, as far as looking at mistakes in general. But the big ones that you're talking about, that would have bothered me. That would have haunted me a little bit. But I think reminiscing versus ruminating on those things can be a positive angle for a lot of people that are still sitting in mistakes that they had made.
Exactly, and I think a mindset shift is really important because if you sort of focus on the shame of it, the guilt of it,
Mhm.
and you have to do that for some period of
Yeah.
time. It's very important to let yourself experience
Right.
negative emotions because
Mhm.
those are often the catalyst to change. But then shifting it to a learning mindset, and I actually heard this, um, it's a saying from a Buddhist monk, right? We should all look at ourselves as students and everything and everyone around us as our teachers.
Yeah.
And I think that those life lessons that can come from stopping and saying, "Okay, what is the universe telling me right here?" is very, very important. I found in the end that the mistakes that I have made as a parent, and those are just 2 examples, trust me, there's others, um, and by the way, I'm not alone, my husband's made some too. Um, I think that those moments have actually built a better relationship between me and my children because not just because it meant engaging in a dialogue about what happened and sort of sharing our own feelings about it because they had, you know, bad feelings about it that had to be worked through. They were scared. They felt
Yeah.
disappointed and let down in a way, but also communicating better about things. Because in both cases, one thing, very important thing I took away was how important communication is and like thinking about what you say and thinking about how you're communicating um, and what you have in your mind when you're having a conversation. There's a whole history. As you said with my daughter, if I hadn't had the experience with my son, I might have approached her
Right.
differently, but I did have that
Yeah.
experience, and sort of trying to be in the moment a little more fully aware of my thought processes. These were all things that I learned from those experiences that I think in the end were valuable and helped me move on.
Yeah. I think sometimes we stumble into mistakes. We just think on the fly, we do something, we're unaware, and we find out later. But I also think that there are those mistakes that we know it is a mistake to do this, but I'm going to find comfort in it now. I'll deal with the punishment later. And as a child, children do that all the time, I think. I mean, I can tell you, I raised kids and I was a kid and I knew that my parent told me not to do this, that it would be a mistake, but you know what? It's going to give me some comfort right now. I'll deal with the punishment later. So sometimes we fall into a mistake and sometimes we choose it,
Those are harder to get past and forgive oneself for, I think.
depending on depending on it. I don't really think about it so much as my childhood choices. I got over it. My parents might not have, but I did.
I think that happens in adults too. I mean, sometimes in marriages, people walk into a situation where they know it's probably a mistake for the health of their relationship.
Yeah.
But they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
And then you have to deal with the cleanup in aisle one, right?
Yeah. No,
Um,
that's true. I mean, I think that happens. I think that people look for comfort. Um, they may have a reason for that mistake, but it might not match what it looks like on the other side or the people that it might hurt, later.
or they might
But
downplay the consequences and know they're there, but think they're unlikely
yeah,
until they come to pass. And then it's like, maybe I made a bad choice.
we're all human. I mean, we make mistakes all the time for different reasons. Sometimes it is self gratification. Sometimes it's for survival of our own soul or spirit. Um, there's things that I've chosen to do for my kids' sake that maybe they're not even aware of, but it was a protective measure for something that they may have done. And I chose to say or to do something to avoid that consequence for them. Yeah, there's a lot of that.
But I
So I
wouldn't
think
call that a mistake because I think of a
it is
mistake.
wrong. Yeah, no, there's a right and a wrong, and I consider a wrong as a mistake, even if the consequence might be lightened. But yeah, I mean, that would take a lot of thought and depend on the situation.
Mhm. I think of a mistake more as there's an unintended negative consequence that occurs from a choice. Not I think that's different from going into something knowing you're making a choice that has a
But
negative
I think there's a lot
consequence.
of that, though. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people actually know the mistake and the consequence, and they choose it anyway for maybe it's survival, of their spirit or whatever it may be. But I think there's different types of mistakes. But I definitely think that there's conscious mistakes.
Do you think there's a different path to forgiveness for those than there is for unintended
I
mistakes?
think there's mistakes that don't require forgiveness. Like in the end, maybe it was the right thing for everybody. Even though you went into it wrong and you knew the consequence, the outcome was beneficial for everybody in the end. So I think there are some mistakes that don't require forgiveness. I think most of them do, for whether it's forgiving yourself or for others. Mistakes are broad. They're from little to really big and deep, right? I mean, you think about the white lies that people say. I mean, I used to say them to my to my parents all the time, and the outcome ended up okay. There was no real forgiveness needed, but it did escape, certain consequences. But in the end, those consequences, if they had been applied or the punishment, I don't think the outcome would have been any different. So,
I think of it a little
different angle.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think of it differently. I mean, for me, if the outcome is beneficial, it's sort of, for me, by definition, not a mistake.
But even a white lie can be considered
I
a
mean,
mistake for
white lie
not.
might be a a decision to make a morally questionable choice, but not necessarily a mistake. I
Yeah.
mean, there is the white lie, right? I mean, what lies
Life's
sometimes
mistakes.
lies can
Anyway.
feel useful. But I'm thinking more in the there's a negative consequence that occurs that you have to carry.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the challenge comes in learning to forgive oneself. If you go into something knowing you're doing it and knowing that, you're going to accept the consequence no matter what, you've forgiven yourself up front. You've actually engaged in
Or you've
that.
dealt with consequence. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Understood. Yeah.
forgiving, right?
Yeah.
But for our purposes and what I kind of envisioned this conversation getting to was teaching people or giving some people some guidance on how to forgive themselves when they haven't intentionally done
Mhm.
something
Or forgive other people.
or forgive
Like,
other
we
people.
talked about this earlier. I mean, before the podcast, I brought up the fact that, to sit in space where an individual has made a mistake that has affected you, and yet they don't realize it. That is uncomfortable. And what consequence, so I tend to like emotionally kind of figure out where that would lead for that individual or myself, and then kind of decide whether you want to even approach it. My personality or who I am, a lot of times I let a lot of that go and just walk away from it. And then I end up holding it in pieces of resentment. And I'm working through that myself. And maybe that's a mistake, right? The mistake is the fact that I'm valuing somebody else's emotional regulation over the situation more than mine. So I think that mistakes and looking at mistakes and reminiscing about them or kind of pulling them apart is a great opportunity for personal growth as well.
Hmm. For me, I think that forgiveness requires, as a first step, acceptance. And you can't extend forgiveness to someone else unless you accept the situation. And that sometimes requires communication so that there's clarity about what both people are thinking about the
Right.
situation. And I've certainly been in those positions before where, two people were having a completely different view of what happened. And so if you just accept it and don't talk about it and move on, you're not really forgiving. You're papering over.
Right.
And for the long-term growth of both people, that's probably not an effective strategy. So I would say first air it, acknowledge it, see what it is, identify it, name it, then work on accepting it. And that's how you bridge your way to forgiveness,
Yeah. I think
both
that
for yourself and for other
yeah, that
people.
works in some situations, and then there's other situations it's not worth the wrath.
But then you're
So
making a decision, and
that's
that's acceptance. It's
right.
just not necessarily forgiveness.
Right. Yeah. No, and you know what? How do you forgive? I think this is probably a whole nother podcast, but forgiving somebody of something they don't even know that they did, or they don't recognize it, or they don't accept it. So there's really then it would just be no forgiveness on either way. And sometimes that just happens.
You know, we
Whether that's a mistake or not, I don't know. But I do think that viewing mistakes can be one sided and not always both.
right, right. I mean, I recently had a situation where I had to have a conversation with someone about something that they did that I think was a mistake, and it had a negative consequence. And I could have opted not to say anything and just move on, but there would have been resentment there. It would have impacted the relationship. And I felt the relationship was important enough that it required opening it up so I could get to forgiveness.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have.
Right.
I would just suggest to people, at least with respect to your own mistakes, be willing to name it and own it. Um, be willing to talk about it.
Right.
Be open about what happened, and then you can move on from there.
Yeah, and there's healing in that, right?
And there is
I
healing.
mean, there's always healing in identifying everything from A to Z, I think.
There is a humorous end to the story of the car crash.
Oh, okay, tell us.
So, for the rest of the week, we stayed at the house at the lake, and we had a wonderful time with the kids. And on the last night we were there, we played the game Apples to Apples. Do you know that
Yeah.
game? Okay, so for those of you who may not know the game, you get a cue card that has a phrase on it, and then everyone is dealt a number of cards that have words on them, and you have to play your word card that best matches that phrase, and whoever the group decides has the best answer wins. So we had played several rounds of Apples to Apples, and at the end, it was me and Max, my son's friend, and we were tied for the lead. So we decided to have a sudden death, um, no pun intended, a sudden death playoff. So we pulled the cue card, and the cue was, "It's complicated." And so I looked at Max and I said, "I'm sorry, honey, but I win." And I played my word card, and it was losing your job.
Oh,
And Max looked at me and he smiled and he said, "No, Mrs. Smith, I win." And he played his card, which was car accident. So
great.
the universe does have its humor. And Elizabeth, I'm thinking, has some questions.
What does real accountability look like without self-punishment?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think to get to real accountability, you have to, as I said, acknowledge, name it, admit it, talk about it. Um, but you have to accept your own humanity. If you go into it like believing that you're never supposed to make a mistake or letting your ego lead, where you're deflecting the true impact of the mistake because it can't be about you, right? I made a mistake, but I did it because of this, or I made a mistake because you did that, or it wasn't even my mistake, it was yours. You're never going to get to accountability. You're never going to get to healing. So accepting that life is hard, that most things are a little bit more complicated than they look on first blush, and that there's many reasons why things happen, but owning your piece of it. It's really important to own your piece of it.
I think it takes time to get there, as we go through life in different stages, but I would agree there is that self-awareness of it, but also I think it's realizing we are all human and there's growth in mistakes, and self-punishment does not get us anywhere at all. You can't move beyond it. So being able to let go and realizing that it happened and you're beyond that and not allowing that mistake to be your identity is how there's no self-punishment later.
Okay. We touched upon like smaller mistakes, but sometimes people can have a mistake that can nearly change everybody's perception of them or their entire identity. Um, and it could have felt like a small mistake in the moment. But what advice would you kind of give to somebody that to stop one bad moment from kind of rewriting their identity?
I think that requires understanding and accepting that there's probably going to be more work done to remedy that. Um, Again, I think it starts with you have to forgive yourself and understand and accept what you did and be willing to move on from there and do the work of healing by proving to other people that it's not a mistake you're going to make again, that you understand the implication of the mistake for them. Um, I think people often want to get past things without talking about it, and that's a huge mistake. That's the biggest mistake of all. Um, Conversation, communication, that's the key to everything, but it's painful and it's difficult. We've did a whole podcast on difficult conversations. It's hard. It's hard to tell someone, I know I disappointed you and, I was wrong. That also requires a huge ego lift, right? To admit it. But you also have to be able to say, you need to give me time to forgive me and to give me time to work on this and prove to you that I am more than that mistake. So I think it really ultimately comes down to openness, conversation, communication.
I think you have to learn to use the lens of love and compassion and reject hate. I think that you have to sit in the fact that you made a mistake, but tap into the side of love, compassion, forgiveness, and don't allow anything else, anything toxic to destroy that, because that's how you are going to heal.